There is a literature that's very, very well developed in economics and political science. It's not Dambisa Moyo's theory. Let me give you some examples. It is very well known that the size of the civil service in many African countries is massive, largely because there's been less of a development of the entrepreneurial skills and innovation that we would like to see across much of the continent. In places like Zambia, over 80% of employees are in the civil service. If you look at the inclination for governments to actually implement some of the things that we need in terms of entrepreneurial culture, it's very difficult. In some countries, it can take up to 2 years to get a business license. This doesn't sound like a good formula for economic growth. And given that over 60% of Africans are under the age of 24, we need to create jobs. Other types of problems that come directly from the large amounts of aid, which by the way are now over $50 billion a year in these government types of flows, are things like inflation, leaving Africans with a large debt burden, and even things like Dutch disease, which some of you might be familiar, because I know the Netherlands is right next door, but it's this notion that you have lots of dollars going into small countries, which means that the currency, the home currency, so my currency in Zambia gets very strong, gets too expensive, nobody wants to buy Zambian goods, and it kills off the export sector. This is a very well-developed literature and cause for a lot of concern. The fundamental problem with the aid system is that African governments treat aid money as permanent. They believe that aid is always going to be there. To the extent that aid has worked, Marshall Plan, the graduates of South Korea and Botswana having received money, or even the Indian Green Revolution, its participation in economics has been short, sharp, and finite. So the Marshall Plan was $100 billion in today's currencies, and it was only for 4 years. Whereas in Africa, we have an open-ended commitment in over $1 trillion of aid, and it's now 60 years later. And if you even dare discuss the possibility of African countries standing on their own and starting to exit from the aid dependency, you end up getting pilloried. There's a quite developed literature on the links. So, for example, Professor Grossman has written extensively about the links between aid and civil war. Many of you will be familiar that Africa in the 1990s had more civil unrest than the rest of the world put together. You'll also be very familiar that in the past year, there have been at least 4 coups across the African continent. The reason is very simple for this. The fact that the private sector remains pretty young. You have most of the money that goes into the economy pooling at the level of the government. So you constantly have factions fighting to get access to that pool of money, because that's where you can actually enrich yourself. There are lots of other things, as I said, they're detailed in the book, but I think if there's one point I want you to leave with, when you leave this evening, is the point that the aid culture disenfranchises Africans. We are virtually unable to hold our governments accountable. As I said to you earlier, when your heads of state do not provide you with infrastructure, healthcare, education, and so on, you can vote them out. In Africa, we've had many presidents who've been in power for 20, 30 years. And the problem is, I would capture it in the following way. You may be familiar that in the United States they have a saying from the Boston Tea Party, which says, no taxation without representation. In Africa, the problem is the reverse Boston Tea Party. We have no representation because there's no taxation. In other words, African governments can stay in power for as long as they wish, as long as they are buddies and friends with the donor community, because it is the donor community who will determine whether or not they stay in office through the amount of money that they get. Until African governments know that they have to please Africans on the ground, it doesn't matter with us having democracy in theory, because ultimately the governments in Africa spend their time courting and catering to the international community and much less time focused on delivering goods and services to their people. I'm going to give you an example. My country has 10 million people. It's landlocked. Some of you may be aware that 1 in 3 Zambians is HIV positive. This is a serious crisis and epidemic by all measures. What you might not be aware of is that over 95% of the infrastructure, so the hardware and the software towards the provision of HIV/AIDS drugs in Zambia is provided by the USAID American Aid Program. As a Zambian, I am concerned about this. As much as I'm grateful that the American people feel that they want to support Africans and support Zambians in particular with this HIV epidemic, I am deeply concerned that a country, i.e. the United States, that has a 10% unemployment rate, has an aging population, and itself is borrowing from China, is the country that our policymakers have seen fit to rely on for sorting out this HIV epidemic. It begs the question, what is the Zambian government doing? What are African governments doing if they are not the ones providing the public goods that I've outlined before? The question we have to ask ourselves as a global society is, what is the role of government? I'm going to quote George Bush, who I'm surprised I'm quoting him, but he did say something which I think is particularly poignant, which is that the aid system is a reflection, and I'm saying that the aid system is a reflection of what George Bush said, which he said, we as a society need to be careful of the soft bigotry of low expectations. The fact that we continue to push an aid system on Africa when there is no evidence whatsoever that any country anywhere on earth has ever achieved growth and reduced poverty by relying on aid to the extent that Africa does today is tragedy. We are pushing a policy that has no evidence of ever working. And at the same time, we have a lot of evidence of what actually works. China, in the past 30 years, has moved over 300 million people out of poverty. India has more people in the middle class today than Europe put together, 450 million people in the middle class in India. This has been in my lifetime. So, did China and India, even South Africa, have they accomplished this by sitting back and relying on aid? No, they have not. They have done this by creating jobs through the tools that I talk about in the second half of the book. I won't go through all of them now because I'm sure I'm getting to the end of my time. But the point I will leave you with here is it's important for us to revamp the system. It is not reasonable to expect African countries to continue to sit back and wait for handouts from the international community when actually it leaves us incredibly vulnerable. The last thing I'm going to do is leave you with a quote from a Nigerian friend of mine who said to me, why are you bothering? Why do you bother wasting your time writing this book? Everybody knows that aid doesn't work, and it's kind of a waste of time. So I said, well, why do you think that the global community continues to feel sorry for Africa and hand out money? And he said the following. He said, Africa is to development what Mars is to NASA. He said, every year, NASA spends, or we spend as a society, millions of dollars going to study and analyze, look at all these different issues, traveling to Mars, traveling to Africa, but nobody actually really believes that we're ever going to live on Mars, and the problem is that nobody actually believes that Africa is going to develop. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.